All right, how's everybody doing today? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. All right, we're about to start. It is Sunday, October 23rd, 2022, and we are live. So normally we're on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. So we're normally on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation WFDF on Sundays, but they're doing maintenance at the radio station. So I'm broadcasting here on my social media platforms because we still have to get this information out. Okay, so stand by. We're about to start. We have a lot to talk about. It's a very, very important show. And let's see. Oh, just a second. Let's get this going. How's everybody doing? Share this broadcasting on social media platforms. Invite your friends to tune in also. All right, we're broadcasting on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. Welcome to the African History Network show. It is Sunday, October 23rd, 2022, and we are live. I'm your host, Brother Michael Imhotep. We're broadcasting on our social media platforms, our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. Normally, we broadcast on 9:10 a.m. Superstation WFDF on Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But they are doing maintenance at the radio station, so they're not having live shows tonight. But we're still going to, I'm still broadcasting live so we can get this information out. It's a lot going on. I was on Roland Martin Unfiltered on Friday discussing some of these topics as well. So we are right about 2 weeks away from the midterm elections. These are the most significant midterm elections since the 1876 midterm elections. I would say the 1876 midterm elections, the year after the Civil War ended. And these are the second midterm elections to take place after an insurrection. Okay, so we have news coming out of Florida dealing with an African-American man in Florida named Robert Lee Wood, who was targeted by Governor Ron DeSantis with this Office of Election Crimes and Security office, this Election Crimes and Security Office, and he was charged with voter fraud for voting illegally. Now, he's an ex-felon. He received his voter registration card in the mail, and he thought he could vote legally. He has had his charges dropped. We know there were at least 20 people who have been charged under this Office of Election Crimes and Security, and he's the first of 20 people who have had their charges dropped. We also see something similar taking place in the state of Texas as well. So we're going to talk about this on today's show. Black man in Florida targeted by Governor Ron DeSantis for voter fraud has charges dropped. Also, we're going to look at some of Florida's racist history of felony disenfranchisement laws. Florida's racist history of felony disenfranchisement laws. And we see this going back to 1868 in the state of Florida, okay, 3 years after the Civil War ends. And it was designed to prevent a Negro legislature. But we see this in the territory of Florida, felony disenfranchisement laws going back to 1838. And this basically means that if you were found guilty of the crime or a felony, you lost your ability to vote. Okay, so we're going to get deep into this history. All this deals with racism. We know that racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, which comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy. And this is a very, very deep history. Now, also, we see racism playing a part when it comes to Louisiana, and it comes to the voting maps, the district maps in Louisiana. There was an article from National Public Radio, NPR.org, which deals with who counts as black in voting maps. Who counts as black in voting maps? Some GOP state officials want that narrowed. And this deals with the state of Louisiana. Now, we know Louisiana is also a former Confederate state as well. We know Louisiana, that territory becomes part of the U.S. because of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And the U.S. gets 828,000 square miles of land from France for less than 3 cents an acre, and is going to actually double the territory of the U.S. at the time, and is going to increase the amount of fertile land that the U.S. has to plant crops, which is going to increase the need for enslaved African labor. Okay. This is the result of the Louisiana Purchase. All right. So if we look at, we're going to talk about this story here from National Public Radio. Who counts as black in voting maps? Some GOP state officials want that narrowed. And we see when we look at this story, when we look at this story here, we see that the thorny question of who counts as black found its way before the U.S. Supreme Court again, ensnared in a major legal battle over the Voting Rights Act that could further gut the landmark law, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and make it harder to protect the political power of voters of color, especially African Americans, because it was because of Americans and what happened to us after Reconstruction ends. This is why you needed a 1965 Voting Rights Act. Okay, so all this deals with history. So we're going to discuss this on today's show as well, on Alex Wagner's show on MSNBC. She did a story about this past week, dealing with what Louisiana is trying to do and who counts as black in voting maps. If our vote did not matter, why are Republicans working so hard to suppress the African American vote as well as non-white voters? If our vote did not matter, why are Republicans working so hard to suppress our vote? So we'll talk about that story, and then also we'll deal with the Ocoee Massacre of November 2nd, 1920. The Ocoee Massacre of November 2nd, 1920 in Florida, Ocoee, Florida. This was when a white mob unleashed the worst election day violence in U.S. history. Okay, this took place in Florida, Ocoee, Florida, November 2nd, 1920, and you're going to have about 50 African Americans who were killed. All right, and once again, this deals with Florida, okay, where you have felony disenfranchisement laws. And when we study Florida's felony disenfranchisement laws, going back to when Florida after Florida becomes a state, going back to 1868, we see that you lost your right to vote for life in Florida. You lost your right to vote for life in Florida. And there were only 4 states in the country where you lost your right to vote for life. Okay, so we'll talk about that on today's show as well. Now, on the African History Network show, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's corrects your own behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. So you control the radius of a man or woman's thoughts. You control the circumference of his or her actions, because the mind can't do or teach what it doesn't know. We deal with a number of different topics here on the African History Network show. We deal with current events in history, politics, education, economic empowerment, entrepreneurship, relationships, love, sex, health issues, and much, much more. Sign up for our email newsletter. Text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, to 22828. To sign up for our email newsletter, text the word Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, to 22828 to sign up for our email newsletter. Also visit our new website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And I'll give you some information as well about our online history classes that we have going on this week as well. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. And from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. We have those. You can register for those at our website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Okay, I want to jump into this first story, and we discussed this on Roland Martin Unfiltered this past Friday, October 21st as well. So I'm going to share a couple of excerpts from Roland Martin Unfiltered also. Okay, if we look at this story here from ABC News, Florida voter has election fraud charges touted by DeSantis dismissed. Florida voter has election fraud charges touted by Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida dismissed. And if you watch this show and watch me on Roland Martin Unfiltered, you know I oftentimes say Florida needs to be desanitized. Florida needs to be desanitized. Governor Ron DeSantis needs to be fired. He's up for re-election November 8th, 2022. He needs to be voted out of office. Now, an African-American man who lives in Florida named Robert Lee Wood, who's 56 years old, had his election fraud charges dismissed on Friday, October 21st, 2022, making him the first of 20 people who Governor Ron DeSantis announced had been charged with voter fraud in August of 2022. Okay. He's the first to beat his case. He's the first to beat these charges. Now, the ruling by Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Milton Hirsch, H-I-R-S-C-H, the ruling dismissed the case after Wood's attorney argued that the prosecutor's office, who filed the twin charges, had no jurisdiction to do so. It was the state's attorney's office that filed the charges, and the infractions have to occur in at least 2 jurisdictions. This alleged infraction, occurred in only 1 jurisdiction. So the state's attorney's office had no jurisdiction to even file charges. Okay. Now, this case garnered national attention and controversy when it was announced on August 18th, 2022. Governor Ron DeSantis said at the time that they were the quote unquote opening salvo by Florida's newly funded Office of Election Crimes and Security, to crack down on voter fraud. This is domestic terrorism. This is voter intimidation. This is like the voter intimidation that we saw with the Clinton, Mississippi massacre or riot of 1875 in Clinton, Mississippi, or the Ocoee Massacre in 1920 in Florida, or the Opelousas Massacre of 1868 in Opelousas, Louisiana. This is pure, unadulterated voter intimidation, voter suppression, domestic terrorism coming from a governor who has presidential aspirations, and you think elections don't have consequences. Now, Robert Lee Wood, who's 56 years old, faced 1 count of making a false affirmation on a voter application and 1 count of voting as an unqualified elector. He had his charges dismissed on the grounds that the prosecutor lacked appropriate jurisdiction. Now, Robert Lee Wood was facing up to 5 years in prison and $5,000 in fines and fees, okay, for allegedly illegally voting in the 2020 election, for allegedly illegally voting, basically almost 2 years ago, okay, for allegedly illegally voting. Okay, the police come to his house, they arrest him, serve an arrest warrant. Now, when the charges were announced on August 18th, 2022, Ron DeSantis said at a press conference that local prosecutors had been, quote unquote, loath to loath to take up election fraud cases. He said, now we have the ability with the Attorney General and statewide prosecutor to bring those cases on behalf of the state of Florida, he said. But a judge on Florida, Judge Milton Hirsch, Miami-Dade County Circuit Judge, Judge Milton Hirsch, found that the statewide prosecutor did not have jurisdiction over one case in Miami. Statewide prosecutors, which are an extension of the Attorney General's office of the state of Florida, are prosecuting all of the election fraud cases that were brought in August. In order for the statewide prosecutor to have jurisdiction, the crimes alleged have to have occurred in at least 2 judicial circuits. In order for the statewide prosecutor to have jurisdiction to prosecute, the crimes alleged must have occurred in at least 2 judicial circuits. Judge Milton Hirsch agreed with the defense's argument, with Robert Lee Wood's defense's argument, that the alleged violations applying to vote and voting while ineligible only occurred in Miami-Dade County. Thus, the statewide prosecutor was found to not have jurisdiction. Now, statewide prosecutors argued that the alleged crimes were committed in Leon County in addition to Miami-Dade County, but the defendant's applications, Robert Lee Wood's applications and votes, were later transmitted to the Department of State in Tallahassee, Florida. Argued that alleged offenses only happened in Miami-Dade County. Okay, the judge sided with the defense, even citing Shakespeare's Henry VI in his order granting the motion to dismiss. Judge Milton Hirsch said, quote, his arms spread wider than a dragon's wings, unquote. The judge wrote in his order in reference to the statewide prosecutor, quote, how much wider even than that does the statewide prosecutor seek to extend his reach? It is an old truth that all politics is local, Judge Milton Hirsch added. The statewide prosecutor seeks to stand that old truth on its end quote. Okay. All right. Now, Larry Davis, the attorney for Robert Lee Wood, said that his motion to dismiss on the grounds of jurisdiction has been circulated to attorneys representing the other election fraud defendants. There are 19 other election fraud defendants in Florida right now. The statewide prosecutor can now appeal the case. If unsuccessful, the Democratic Miami-Dade State Attorney Catherine Fernandez Rundle, R-U-N-D-L-E, will also have the option to file charges. Okay. All right. So check out the rest of this story here from ABC News. Florida voter has election fraud charges touted by DeSantis dismissed. Okay. Now, we also saw something similar to this taking place in Texas. There's a good article from the Washington Post dealing with GOP voter fraud crackdown as charges are dropped in Florida and Texas. GOP voter fraud crackdowns falter as charges are dropped in Florida and Texas. Okay. And if we look at this story very quickly here from this is from actually the New York Times. I think I may have said Washington Post. The story is actually from the New York Times. This deals with both Florida and Texas. Now, if our votes didn't matter, why are Republicans working so hard to suppress the African-American vote and many Latinos and Asian Americans and millennials and Gen Z, etc.? GOP voter fraud crackdowns falter as charges dropped in Florida and Texas. One man who had his charges dismissed was among a group of former felons who were rounded up in August under orders from Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. And this also talks about Robert Lee Wood as well. Okay, so check out this article here. Check out this piece here from the New York Times as well by Neil Vigdor, October 21st, 2022. Okay. They talk about Robert Lee Wood. Okay, 56 years old. He spent 2 decades in prison for second-degree murder. Mr. Wood was among the 20 people who were recently arrested in Florida on voter fraud charges and became the first defendant to have them dropped. That happened in Miami-Dade County Circuit Court on Friday, October 21st. Now, they also talk about Texas. And on Monday, this past Monday in Texas, which was October 17th, a district court judge in Texas set aside the indictment of Hervis Earl Rogers, another African-American man. I remember this case here. He stood in line for something like 7 hours. Yeah, I remember this case when it happened. And we talked about this on Roland Martin Unfiltered as well. A district court judge in Texas set aside the indictment of Hervis Earl Rogers, an African-American Houston man who gained widespread attention for waiting 7 hours in line to vote during the 2020 primary election. In 2021, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's a Republican, charged Hervis Rogers with voting illegally because he was on parole. He charged him with voting illegally because he was on parole. Once again, this is pure, unadulterated voter intimidation to make examples out of these people, to suppress the African-American vote and scare people who have felony records, etc., from voting, even when they get voter registration cards in the mail, etc. Now, a lack of evidence of widespread voter fraud has not stopped Republicans from aggressively pursuing it in states where they hold power. Now, the unraveling of the 2 high-profile cases has compromised the legitimacy of those efforts. Brian Griffin, the spokesman for Governor Ron DeSantis, said in an email on Friday that the state disagreed with the dismissal of charges against Robert Lee Wood and would appeal the ruling. Okay, go ahead and appeal. Governor, the order needs to be desanitized. Okay, Governor Ron DeSantis has to be defeated. Charlie is a much better candidate, even though he used to be a Republican and he's a Democrat now. He's the former Republican governor of the state of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis needs to be defeated. Okay, so we discussed all of this on Roland Martin Unfiltered on Friday, October 21st, and Roland spoke with Desmond Meade. Okay, and Desmond Meade heads up the Florida the organization to restore voting rights for felons, Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. And we've talked about Desmond Meade here on the show before, and he's been on Roland Martin Unfiltered a number of times. And Desmond Meade led the effort back in 2018 to put the issue of the restoration of voting rights for ex-offenders, put that on the ballot in Florida. Okay, and it got, I think, something like 66% of the vote. It passed with about 66% of the vote, something like that. Passed overwhelmingly. Okay, but then what the Florida State Legislature did was they then added a stipulation that all your fees had to be paid, restitution and fees, things like this had to be paid before you can vote, to put another obstacle in the way of ex-offenders voting. So we discussed all this on Roland Martin Unfiltered, and let's go to this clip here.
All right, folks, we told you how Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been targeting black and brown folks formerly incarcerated there with his BS voter crime integrity, waste of money unit. And we told you about there were about 20-some-odd people who were arrested. We showed you that video. You remember the video? Let's play it again. This is a video that was released, body cam video, where the police, I mean, they were apologetic literally in arresting individuals who supposedly voted illegally, even though the state said they could actually vote. Well, Florida judges set a precedent today by, guess what, throwing out charges against Robert Lee Wood. One count of voting as an unqualified elector and one count of making a false affirmation on a voter application. The judge dismissed his charges because the prosecutor lacked jurisdiction. The state alleged Wood registered and voted knowing he was ineligible because of a 1991 conviction. Wood said he did not know he was ineligible to vote because he received a Florida voter registration card. Under Florida law, individuals who exit prison, that's right, have their voting rights restored after leaving the system. Now, again, what you have here is Ron DeSantis trying to conjure up this whole idea of voter fraud. Now, if you want actual voter fraud, go to the Villages, a largely Republican community where there were people who were actually arrested for illegally voting. Desmond Meade, the executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He joins me now from Florida. I mean, bottom line is here. You know, y'all got Amendment 4 passed, voted overwhelmingly. Republicans in the state, they do not want to see all those formerly incarcerated people voting. They put roadblocks. They threw up there, having now to pay all your fines. And they went to the Supreme Court, got it affirmed there. And it's just one thing after another. Now you have this latest attack against folks who are formerly incarcerated. And we're talking about 20-some-odd folks. Would you say there were lots more who were being targeted by DeSantis?
Oh, yes. No, Roland, one of the things I tell folks, you know, when they ask me about my reaction about this case getting dropped, you know, I have, I'm guarded enthusiasm. And it's because, you know, I know that there are thousands of people, you know, back in, I believe, prior to June of 2021, there was a list of thousands of individuals that was given to the state that allegedly should not have been voting. And, you know, people talk about the 20, but we know that 10 folks prior to the 20 in April of this year was arrested. One of them was a homeless man. You had a grandfather that was pulled out of his home and arrested. But I want to share this with you, Roland, because I think this really centers where I and my organization are coming from. FDLE did an investigation of the initial 10 people in Alachua County back at the beginning of this year. And one of the statements from one of the gentlemen that was on the investigation was read like this: I wanted to be a part of civilization instead of being hidden away from crack and everything else in the dark hole. I wanted to be a part of life again. So I said, let me try to vote. It felt good to be a part of something instead of being hidden away. You know, and I read that statement because it really centers me on people, right? At the end of the day, man, we're talking about returning citizens of this country that just want to be a part of democracy, but because of the political gamesmanship that we see going on, that we have people that are suffering, people that are being arrested, people that are being traumatized, families that are hurting. You know, what we don't hear about is that every man or woman that gets arrested, if they're the breadwinner for their family, right, while they're incarcerated trying to post bail, guess what? Who is providing for their family? These people could be losing their jobs. And there we go, exasperating the collateral consequences that people with convictions or people that are interacting with our criminal justice face. And all for what, right? For some kind of gain? You know, because at the end of the day, none of these people should have even been arrested.
The thing here that is amazing that they're arrested. Now they got to go through all of this crap. Now they got to go through the legal system. Now they got to hire attorneys. Now they got to incur more costs. We can just go on and on and on again. And that's what's also shameful. And then now you go to court and the charges get dropped. Well, they can't recoup all that money they lost. And it's not like these are people with sitting on a bunch of money. I mean, you see this video right here, this black woman, she's like, what? And then she goes, let me go tell my husband. No, man, we got it. We'll go tell your husband. I mean, it's crazy.
Roland, you know, I'm one of the things I'm just grateful that God has really allowed me and my wife to really be in the line of work that we are, because right now, you know, FRC, our efforts have created funds to allow people who've been arrested, we will take care of their bail, right? And we'll also, if they want to, we would help provide them legal defense free of charge, right? And then the one thing that we have to also worry about is that when they're arrested, that arrest get on their record. Then, of course, you know, Sheena with the Clean Slate Initiative, that's something that they're working on to clear these arrest records off of people's records so people will be able to get jobs and housing and to be able to really thrive, right, and be successful in life.
And let's be clear what's happening here. You got Republican states attorneys who are saying, okay, this makes no sense. This was a letter, go to my iPad, this was a letter that you sent me, and this is dated October 14, 2022. Sex offenders voting in elections. The Lake County Supervisor of Elections presented 6 cases for review concerning convicted sex offenders voting in the 2020 general election. Letter goes through laying out the statute, things along those lines. This is what the state's attorney office said.
Yes, and rightfully so, Roland. You know, one of the things that a lot of folks are not talking about is caught up in this snare or this persecution of returning citizens are people who registered as Republicans, right? And so when we look at the total breadth of people who've been impacted, you know, I thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to really talk about what does democracy really mean to us, right? You know, some people, they were concerned about the raid on Mar-a-Lago, saying, you know, why would the FBI want to raid Donald Trump's residence 2 years before the presidential election? Well, if they're concerned about that, they ought to be outraged that people are getting arrested on the eve of election.
Right.
Not 1 or 2 years before an election, but on the eve of elections and during elections, you have people being drugged by out of their homes. You have people who, when they were arrested, the SWAT team came to arrest them as if they were Pablo Escobar.
And it is about intimidation. And here's the thing this letter says. It says 2 things: a person who willfully swears or affirms falsely to any oath or affirmation, or willfully procures another person to swear or affirm falsely to oath or affirmation, okay, goes on, explains committing a felony. This is what they say. In all of the instances where sex offenders voted, each appear to have been encouraged to vote by various mailings and misinformation. Each were given voter registration cards, which would lead one to believe they could legally vote in the election. The evidence fails to show willful actions on a part of these individuals. Therefore, the state is unable to file charges. And this is not, from you, this is not a progressive state's attorney.
That's right. This is a person that is following the law and not getting caught up in politics. You know, that gentleman whose statement I read, in his particular case, him and 9 other people, while they were incarcerated, was approached by the local supervisor of election that told them that they can vote, right? In one case, the supervisor of elections told one of the individuals that was incarcerated, give me your name, right? I'm going to run your name through the system. If you get a pamphlet from me, that means that you can register to vote. Guess what? A couple weeks later, what this man got? He got a pamphlet. So he registered to vote, and he voted, right? And then 2 years later, now the state is coming and attacking him when they ought to be attacking the system that is broken. And that is something that we've been saying since Bush v. Gore, when we've seen thousands of people were removed from the voting roll because they were erroneously classified as returning citizens or being unable to vote because of a felony conviction. So we knew that this system had problems way back then. right? Amendment 4 just exacerbated the problems, especially with the requirement of the payment of fines and fees. But the system needs to be fixed. And before a state can take a person, American citizens' liberty, right? That's the thing that is guarded the most in this country, right? A person's liberty. Before the state can just haphazardly just take a person's liberty like that, they need to clean up their side of the street. They need to get their ends taken care of. They need to do their doggone job.
Well, it's what this is, I think what those arrests are for is to actually scare the hell out of anybody formerly incarcerated to go, oh, you know what, I better not vote because, you know, I might get arrested. I mean, we see what Ron DeSantis is trying to do.
Roland, that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to come on the show, because I understand that this may have a chilling impact on people, right? But I want to ensure anybody that's listening in the state of Florida, and if you have friends or family that's in the state of Florida, that the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, I can tell you right now, right here, right, in living color, that we're standing with each and every one of them. That's why we started the bail fund that anyone could donate to. We're bailing people out. And that gentleman that had his case shop is because we arranged for him to be represented by a criminal legal defense counsel, right? And so we're fighting this tooth and nail. We're pushing back. And our message is that a person ought to do their due diligence to see if they're eligible. And if they truthfully, honestly, earnestly believe that they have the right to vote, that they should not let any of this prevent them from going out to vote. And if they think that they may not have the right to vote, at the very bare minimum, they need to get 5 to 10 of their family members and friends to turn out and vote on their behalf, right, in this election. Make sure that we're sending politicians a very clear message. Returning citizens don't scare easy.
Desmond Meade, always good to see you, man. Thank you so very much. Look, we're going to be right here, again, letting people know about these issues because what too many of these Republicans are doing is that they don't want free and fair elections. They don't want to open the opportunities for everybody to vote. And this is all meant to have a chilling effect on the formerly incarcerated, the 1.4 million people in Florida. And it makes no sense whatsoever. And as you said, there are people who are formerly incarcerated who are registering as Republicans. So there's no assumption that all of these people are going to be Democrats. But what they're doing here just simply makes no sense whatsoever. And it's a massive waste of taxpayer money.
Oh, of course, it definitely is. And, you know, it's a shame that this is going on now. You know, one of the things I said earlier was that, you know, you would expect people who we elected to office or appoint into certain positions to not try to manufacture excuses for a failed system or a broken system. What we expect these individuals to do is to develop solutions, right, to these problems. Not put the blame on citizens when the responsibility is really on the state. All
right, then. Desmond Meade, I appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks. Again, another example of what Republicans are doing is in the state of Texas. They cannot stand Harris County. Why? Because Harris County has gone blue in many ways. And so Republican Governor Greg Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, the Secretary of State, the thug Attorney General Paxton, they have been targeting Harris County. Remember, they battled them when it came to the voting changes they put in place during COVID. Now they're trying to send in observers to look at the vote in Harris County. Why? No reason whatsoever. Now Harris County leaders, Mayor Sylvester Turner, Judge Linda Hidalgo, they have sent a request to the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, for federal monitors. In the letter, Harris County officials say they are concerned about the timing of the Texas Secretary of State and Attorney General's plan to send inspectors, election security trainers, and legal advisors to observe the election. Harris County is the state's largest metropolitan area. And of course, as I said, Democratic leaning. The changing demographics, Texas Republicans have made it harder to vote in the state, and this move adds to the restrictive measures to intimidate and add doubt to voters' confidence. The DOJ has not responded to Harris County's request. Joining us now is Harris County Attorney Christian Menifee, one of the signees of the letter. Christian, glad to have you on. Christian.
Okay, let me pause it right here because I want to fast forward to just stand by. want to fast forward to when Roland goes to the panel. Okay. But we discussed this on Friday, October 21st on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Somebody asked, why am I sharing this? I'm a panelist on Roland's show every Friday. I've been on there for 2 years. I started August, I think it was August or October 2020. I've been on for 2 years. And this deals directly with what we're talking about here. So let me fast forward to this when he goes to the panel here. Okay, let's go back to this clip. And then we're going to get into some of the history of Florida's felony disenfranchisement law and why it was put in place. This is why you needed Amendment 4. Okay, this is why you needed Amendment 4 in 2018. And if we look at this, piece here from the Brennan Center for Justice, and then we'll go back to the clip. This right here, okay, Brennan Center for Justice, voting rights restoration efforts in Florida. This piece is from August 10th, 2022. Was last updated August 10th, 2022, originally May 31st, 2019. Disenfranchisement in Florida, talks about Amendment 4. In November 2018, nearly 65% of Florida voters approved Amendment 4, a constitutional amendment that automatically restored voting rights to most Floridians with past convictions who had completed the terms of their sentence. Shortly thereafter, in June 2019, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Senate Bill 7066 into law, prohibiting returning citizens, ex-offenders, from voting unless they pay off certain legal financial obligations, LFOs, legal financial obligations imposed by a court pursuant to a felony conviction. They put in another obstacle. They put it on the ballot to restore voting rights. It was approved overwhelmingly. Okay, nearly 65% of voters approved it on the 2018 ballot. Then the Republican-controlled state legislature in Florida then comes up with Senate Bill 7066 to put another obstacle in the way of the Amendment 4 that just passed, once again to suppress the vote. Okay, the Brennan Center for Justice and other civil and voting rights groups filed a lawsuit challenging the law. The trial court found Florida's pay-to-vote system unconstitutional, in part because it is often not possible to determine whether a returning citizen is eligible to vote because the state does not reliably or consistently track data on LFOs, okay, legal financial obligations. However, the in-bank 11th reversed and vacated the lower court's ruling, and they have a link there for more information. Now, this part right here, the history of Amendment 4. Prior to Amendment 4 in 2018, Florida's state constitution, permanently disenfranchised all citizens who had been convicted of any felony offense unless the clemency board restored their voting rights, a process that will now apply to those who have not had their rights restored by Amendment 4, including anyone convicted of murder or felony sexual offenses. Now, between 2010 and 2016, the number of disenfranchised Floridians grew by nearly 150,000 just in that 6-year period of time. Between the year 2010 and 2016, the number of disenfranchised Floridians who lost their right to vote because of a felony conviction grew by nearly 150,000 to an estimated total of 1,686,000 in 2016. Okay, more than 1 in 5 of Florida's Black voting age population was disenfranchised because of a felony conviction. more than 20%, more than 20% of Florida's African American voting age population is eliminated from voting because of this felony disenfranchisement law that dates back to 1868 in the Florida State Constitution, which was put in place to prevent a prevent a Negro legislature. It was put in place purposely to prevent a Negro legislature because in 1868 and right after slavery ends, 48% of the population of the state of Florida were African Americans as a legacy of slavery, because Florida was a slaveholding state and Florida was a Confederate state that seceded from the Union, fought on behalf of the traitors to the Union to maintain slavery. They feared, even before the 15th Amendment was adopted in 1870, they feared that these African Americans would vote and take over the Florida state legislature. So they made sure they put policies in place to keep that from happening. And we're still dealing with the legacy of this today. We're still dealing with the legacy of slavery. We're still dealing with the legacy of the Reconstruction era to this day. Okay, so I want to go back to this clip here from Roland Martin, Unfiltered.
So this is go on iPad, please. When it pulls up, it's called the fight for. It's called the Fight for Democracy. I'm going to pull it up right now. Give me 1 second. We're going to be there with a number of entertainers, other speakers, and activists as well. Again, encouraging folks to vote. Early voting is taking place. We are seeing massive turnout of early voting in various places. And so you see it right there, the Fight for Democracy. Again, working with the NAACP Sunday, 4 to 7 p.m. At Avenida Plaza. And Bun B, LaToya Luckett, Slim Thug, DJ Mr. Rogers, DJ Frank Ski, Lil Kiki, Spud Howard, Lenora, Mango Punch, and many others will be there. And this is a partnership with a number of organizations. This GOTV rally taking place in Houston. Let's introduce my panel right now, folks, to talk about this. Again, what is happening, because I keep warning y'all, we can sit here and play games if we want to, but what Republicans are trying to do is devious. Understand how utterly ridiculous it is, and their whole strategy is to keep us from voting, because they know if we use our power and if we drive our numbers in a significant way, they cannot win, which is why I keep telling y'all, if we start voting at 70 and 75 and 80, 85, 90% of our capacity, we could flip elections all across the country, all across the South, the Midwest, the Southeast. But it can't happen when our turnout is at 35, 40, 45, 50%. It simply can't happen. Matt Manning, civil rights attorney. Michael Imhotep, hosts the African History Network show. Dr. Nola Haynes, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Glad to have all three of y'all here. I mean, look, Matt, you're there in Texas. You take the case in Florida, how they're targeting folks, those formerly incarcerated. You look at what they're doing, trying to do to Harris County. This is all a part of the Republican strategy across the country to keep us from voting. This is classic voter suppression.
Absolutely. There's no question that it's classic voter suppression. And as it relates to Florida, what's particularly interesting there is that Ron DeSantis, obviously we know he's doing all of this to try to get reelected, dispatched state's attorneys who didn't even have jurisdiction. So, the court threw it out because there was no evidence that the crimes actually took place in two different counties. And that's like a threshold issue. That's something that a basic prosecutor would look at and know whether they have jurisdiction or not. So that's what's particularly insidious, is that, they're going forward on claims that they know they can't prove because they want to chill people's right to vote. As it relates to Texas, you're exactly right. I mean, they attacked Harris County during the pandemic, trying to, I think, cut it down to one drive-through mail ballot box for an entire county of 4 million people. I mean, not even hiding their position and not even hiding their strategy. So I think you're right. I think the right to vote is completely under assault here in Texas. And Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis, as I say every week, are both trying to use people as pawns to get reelected. All of this is not only the Republican strategy, but their individual strategy to try to stay and to leverage some of that, votes from the Republican base, and to let people know, look, we're doing everything we can to keep this America the way you want it and the way we think it should be. And they're not hiding that fact at all.
Look, Nola, I mean, I can tell you right now, folks are watching, people out there who are like, oh, I'm not quite sure. Look, there's a very deliberate effort by Republicans across this country. We can just go state by state. So this is not, isolated. No, this is all by design, because they know if they shrink the electorate, they got a better chance of winning. Why is Donald Trump so angry? Because the electorate expanded in 2020 with mail-in balloting and ballot drop boxes, and Republicans are pissed that they lost.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's really nice to be in studio, so I'm happy to be here. And it is strategic, and it's strategic and it's very dangerous. I often feel like, lately, like Thanos snapped his finger and like half of the population across galaxies disappeared. It's like he snapped his finger and we're like back in the 1950s before civil rights legislation. That's what it really feels like. The fact that the federal government has to come in and monitor voting, that is just mind-blowing, and it's setting a very dangerous precedent. And, again, by design and strategy, it's to intimidate voters not to vote, especially when we think about the change in our country. It has been over time, but it's also been abrupt in many ways. You have people who just want to live their lives. They want to get up and go to work, enjoy their own time with their friends and their family. We weren't thinking about having to get up and marching in the streets to protect our voting rights. So there's this level of comfort that we've all been in, to now we're waking up to a very different world where we're not mobilized the same ways in which we were. So I'm really happy that event is happening that you're going to in Houston. But we really woke up and we're in a different time, and it's calling for different types of measures. And, I hate to say it, we have to get out there and we have to continue fighting. As tired as I know, especially Black folks are, we have to continue fighting, because we are not in a country right now where equality and equity are on par. We are still having to fight for just basic liberties, basic democratic rights, such as voting.
Michael, when we walk through this, we walk through these issues, and people go, this is really not that big of a deal. It's not that alarming. What they're not understanding, when Steve Bannon and his minions out here are saying this crazy stuff, when they're talking about what they want to take over, they're serious. They are running people for secretaries of state.
Absolutely.
For election supervisors. They are desperately trying to overturn elections. And the thing I keep trying to tell all these Black people, they're not hiding it. This is not overt. No, this is not covert. It's very overt. They're saying, if we win, Trump's going to win. They're saying it.
Yep. And they're letting you know what's going to happen. They say they're going to impeach Biden. They say they're going to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. But you talk about Stephen K. Bannon. Bannon said some months ago on his podcast that the way to political power in America today is through the local school boards. And if you study what's happened with the local school boards and the fights over banning books, the fights over critical race theory, this is funded by dark money. This is funded by, and they've organized numerous organizations. There was an expose by NBC News, and they estimated about 165 right-wing parent organizations across the country, have been funded, and they get help from Fox News and politicized by Fox News. And they're using this to go from the grassroots up to the federal government and and focus on local offices, local politicians, local political offices, from the grassroots up. We look at what's going on in Florida. I cannot stress this enough. I know, Roland, when you were interviewing Desmond Meade, and shout out to that brother, you were saying that this doesn't make sense or something like this. It makes perfect sense when you understand the history of Florida.
Okay, Florida was the first state to have poll taxes in 1889, before Mississippi had poll taxes. Florida instituted its felony disenfranchisement law in 1868, 2 years before the 15th Amendment was adopted. And when you go research the history of Florida, they did this. They instituted felony disenfranchisement laws in a state that had a 48% black population. Almost half of the state of Florida, after slavery ended, was African American, and they knew that if they did not put laws in place, these black people would vote and take over the state legislature.
Yep.
Okay, so this makes perfect sense. What we have to understand is that this may be our last free and fair election here in 2022.
That's real. Yeah.
This people don't understand how dangerous this stuff is. These people are playing for keeps.
Indeed, indeed. Got to go to a quick break, folks. We come back. We're going to talk about an effort, the combined comedy with voting. It's all about, folks, using every tool at our disposal to turn people out in this November midterm elections. We'll discuss that next on Roland Martin Unfiltered right here on the Black Star Network.
Okay, so that was from Friday, October 21st. You can watch that full video on Roland Martin's YouTube channel, Roland S. Martin on YouTube, and Roland S. Martin on Facebook. Also download the Black Star Media app, and you can watch the show there as well. And I'll post the link here on the thread of the broadcast also to the video. If we look at, I want to look at this. I want to look at this history here. Okay, we want to look at some of the history of Florida's felony disenfranchisement law and why it was put in place. And this is why history is so important. And a people's history and culture teaches them how to deal with the problems of the past, in the present, and the future, to meet the needs of the community. And we see history, if it's not repeating itself, is definitely rhyming. If it's not repeating itself, it is definitely rhyming. Okay. Let's see here. Let me pull this up just a second. All right. And then also I want to show you this article that we've talked about numerous times here on the show before. This deals with the expose that I mentioned from NBC News. Okay. Go to this here. Okay, this article right here, read this one. This is about 16 pages when I printed it out. This deals with critical race theory battle invades school boards with help from conservative groups. Critical race theory battle invades school boards with help from conservative groups. Okay, this is from NBC News, June 15th, 2021. In towns nationwide, well-connected conservative activists and Fox News have ramped up the tension in fights over race and equity in schools. And this is all part of an effort to galvanize Republicans, galvanize conservatives, to get them to turn out to vote in the November 2022 midterm elections. All right. This is from June 15, 2021. So this gives you background information on the book bans and parents' rights and all this stuff, and how this whole thing happened. Okay. If we look at page 3 quickly here, it says conflicts like this are playing out in cities and towns across the country. Conflicts like this are playing out in cities and towns across the country amid the rise of at least 165 local and national groups that aim to disrupt lessons on race and gender, according to an NBC News analysis of media reports and organizations promotional materials, reinforced by conservative think tanks, law firms, and activist parents. These groups have found allies and families frustrated over COVID-19 restrictions in schools and have weaponized the right's opposition to critical race theory, turning it into a political rallying point. All right, read this entire article from NBC News. Critical race theory battle invades school boards with help from conservative groups. Okay, now if we go back to I want to go to this piece from the Brennan Center for Justice, and this deals with a history of Florida's felony disenfranchisement law. This one right here. This is at Brennan Center for Justice. Is from Florida's deals with Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in conjunction with them also, which is Desmond Meade's organization. History of Florida's disenfranchisement provision. Let's see. Can we increase that? Okay. Do it like this. All right. So the Florida State Constitution imposes a lifetime ban on voting. And let me see, how can I want to increase the size of this. Okay, we'll just do it like this here. Florida State Constitution imposes a lifetime ban on voting by every person with a felony conviction unless the governor and his cabinet choose to restore the individual's right to vote. The ban has long barred African Americans from the polls at twice the rate of other Florida citizens, even without counting those who are still serving criminal sentences. 13% of voting age African Americans in Florida have lost their right to vote. Okay. Even without counting those who are still serving criminal sentences, 13% of voting age African Americans have lost their right to vote. But generally speaking, when you count those who are incarcerated, it's over 20%, over 1 in 5 of Florida's African American voting age population has lost their right to vote. Now, the constitutional provision disenfranchising people with felony convictions was originally enacted in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War in 1868. Okay. And on Tuesdays, I teach an online history class from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968, where we go through and deal with all this history and look at these laws, look at these state constitutions, etc. So you can register for that at our website, theAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. So enacted in the aftermath of the Civil War in 1868 as one of several tools to suppress the votes of newly freed slaves. 100 years later, in 1968, the provision was reenacted despite its history of discrimination and its continuing racially disparate effects. Felony disenfranchisement has long been used to diminish the voting power of Florida's African American population, and the law continues to have that effect. Felony disenfranchisement has long been used to diminish the voting of Florida's African-American population, and the law continues to have that effect. Okay, so if we go and look at this history here, okay, criminal disenfranchisement and Reconstruction, Florida. Okay, so Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. During that period of time, when you're having the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed to the U.S. Constitution, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is letting African Americans legally enter into contracts, and is protecting their rights to enter into labor contracts, different things like this. Okay. In 1868, Florida dramatically expanded criminal disenfranchisement. 1868. For the first time in 1868, the state barred from the voter polls all people with felony convictions, while at the same time, they created a host of new felonies. Okay, so Florida, in 1865, they institute their black codes, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Okay, which regulates the movements of the newly freed African Americans. But then they are going to dramatically expand what is classified as a felony. Okay, so that you can exclude more African Americans from voting. For the first time in 1868, the state of Florida barred from the polls all people with felony convictions, while at the same time creating a host of new felony crimes. The list of disqualifying infamous crimes was expanded as well. Okay, now, blacks were disproportionately disenfranchised under the new provision because state policies at the time were designed to control newly freed slaves through the criminal justice system. In 1865, the Florida state legislature enacted black codes. 1865. Okay, so the Civil War, for most practical purposes, comes to an end April 9th, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant in Virginia, Appomattox Courthouse. But it doesn't officially come to an end until August of 1866, because there were other Confederate armies that still were operating. Even though General Robert E. Lee's army was the largest, his army was not the only one. So there were other Confederate armies like General Joseph E. Johnston's Army of Tennessee and Nathan Bedford Forrest's army as well. So terms of surrender had to be negotiated with each one of those Confederate generals. So after that takes place, is going to be in August of 1866 that President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865, President Andrew Johnson announces the official end to the U.S. Civil War 16 months after April 1865. So in 1865, the Florida state legislature enacted black codes as a way to control freedmen or former slaves, the black freedmen. A crucial component of the black codes was an expansion of the criminal justice system to deal with minor offenses that state legislators believed African Americans were likely to commit. Okay, they expanded crimes that they believed that African Americans were likely to commit and that have been formally punished by their masters. These were crimes that have been formally punished by their masters. So they're using the laws to control the movement and actions of African Americans in trying to re-envision slavery. Okay, trying to re-envision the control mechanisms from slavery, trying to refashion that after slavery ends. The black codes had their desired effect. By the 1870s and 1880s, estimates show that more than 95% of the convicts in the Florida convict camps were African American. Okay, more than 95% of the convicts in the Florida convict camps, okay, prison camps, were African American. A captain in one of the camps at that time noted it was possible to send a Negro to prison. Let's see, hold on. It was possible to send a Negro to prison on almost any pretext, but difficult to get a white man there. It was possible to send a Negro to prison on almost any pretext, but difficult to get a white man there. Now, when we look at felony disenfranchisement in 1868, the 1868 Florida State Constitution instituted felony disenfranchisement and was part of a larger effort to prevent a Negro legislature. It was part of a larger effort to prevent a Negro legislature. So when what's the voter suppression that's taking place today, not just in Florida, but in Texas, in Georgia, especially these former Confederate states? This is all a continuation of what happened during Reconstruction. And these southern states put these laws in place to prevent a Negro legislature. Okay. And when you look at what happened in Mississippi in 1890, the Mississippi State Constitution, where they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests. Okay. They did this. Solomon Saladin Calhoun, who was the White County judge who presided over the Mississippi State Convention. Okay. He said that they did this to exclude the Negro. That's not me saying it. That's what he said. This is an article I refer to often. May 1st, 2021, Ronald G. Schaefer, Washington Post. The Mississippi plan to keep blacks from voting in 1890. Quote, we came here to exclude the Negro. The poll taxes that were, Florida was the first state to have poll taxes in 1889 before Mississippi. Mississippi writes this into their state constitution at this convention. And this, what Mississippi did, became known as the Mississippi Plan, which became the model of what the other southern states did to suppress the African-American vote and to get us wiped out of political office during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. Okay, there are about 2,000 African-American men who get elected to public office and you're going to have about 20 that get elected to Congress, things like this during the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877. When Reconstruction comes to an end with the Compromise of 1877, where Republicans agreed to let where Democrats agreed to let Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for the presidency, become president if he will remove the remaining Union troops out of those southern states, South Carolina and Florida, and there was one other state, okay, because there was only 3 states by this time that still had Union troops in them, but they were still enforcing to a certain extent the new rights of African Americans. The Democratic Party at that time, they wanted the remaining Union troops removed out of the South, okay, in exchange for letting Rutherford B. Hayes become president, because neither Rutherford B. Hayes or Samuel J. Tilden, who was the Democratic candidate for president, neither one had enough electoral college votes to become president. Okay, Rutherford B. Hayes was 1 vote short, if I remember correctly. Okay, he was 1 vote shy. So this was the compromise. This brings about an end to Reconstruction. And for all these Black Republicans and Black conservatives like Candace Owens and what's his name, Keith Jackson, who I was on the Tammy Mack show, The Business of Being Black on the Foxhole TV network. And I was dealing with these 2 Black Republicans that don't understand history. One of them was a big Donald Trump supporter. Okay. They never want to talk about the Compromise of 1877, where Republicans turned their backs on African Americans and betrayed African Americans. They don't want to talk about that, and they don't want to talk about the Lily White movement in 1928, which was an effort by Republicans to get Herbert Hoover elected as president during the 1928 presidential election. He was running against a moderate Democrat from New York named Al Smith. So the Republicans implement a Southern strategy. They appeal to 5 former Confederate states to get segregationist Democrats in those 5 former Confederate states to vote for Herbert Hoover, and Republicans start ignoring the issues pertaining to African Americans. They ignore the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which comes back into power in the 1920s. A lot of that has to do with the movie The Birth of a Nation, which debuted February 8th, 1915. And the movie The Birth of a Nation showed the Klan as being the heroes. In many newspaper ads that advertised the movie The Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan would take out recruiting ads next to those ads. So you have a resurgence in the power of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and you have Republicans starting to ignore the needs and concerns of African Americans and push us out of the Republican Party. This is known as the Lily White movement of 1928. And so we start slowly going over to the Democratic Party because we see them as more receptive to our issues. And then Roosevelt, Delano Roosevelt, and 1947 presidential election, 1947, 1948, Democrats have a pro-civil rights agenda. At the same time, you have Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who's a Dixiecrat, Southern segregationist Democrat. He runs as a Dixiecrat for president. He loses. Strom Thurmond is going to leave the Democratic Party and go over to the Republican Party. So you're going to start, you have this party realignment that takes place where a lot, as more African Americans go over to the Democratic Party, and you have civil rights acts that are passed even before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You're going to have a lot of these Southern segregationist Democrats leave the Democratic Party and go over to the Republican Party. Then you have 1964, where Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona runs for president against Lyndon Johnson. And Barry Goldwater runs on an anti-civil rights platform. Okay. Lyndon Johnson wins. He wins. So Johnson becomes president after Kennedy is assassinated in November 1963. So then Johnson runs for he finishes Kennedy's term, and then he runs for election in 1964. Okay. Then in 1968, Lyndon Johnson does not run for re-election. And Richard Nixon, who ran against Kennedy in 1960 and lost, Richard Nixon runs for president. Nixon runs on a campaign of law and order, and he runs on a campaign as a backlash of white people, white Republicans especially, against the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the rebellions that are taking place all across the country in inner cities, like the Detroit Rebellion in 1967 and Newark, New Jersey, things like this. He runs in opposition of affirmative action, okay? And he runs on a platform of law and order, which is another type of Southern strategy to appeal to white people and basically say, I will protect you from those people. I will protect you from those people. And then he becomes president. And then Donald Trump ran on a similar platform in 2016 because part of Donald Trump's platform was law and order, which was a throwback to Richard Nixon in 1968. Okay, so when we look at this right here, what happened at the Mississippi State Convention of 1890, because all this history is connected. Okay, this is why you have to understand the chronology of history and cause and effect and how these different events are connected. The Mississippi State Convention's president, Solomon Saladin Calhoun, a white county judge, put the voting issue bluntly. He said, let's tell the truth if it bursts the bottom of the universe. He said, we came here to exclude the Negro. We came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer. So delegates at the 1890 Mississippi State Convention eventually adopted a literacy test and poll tax geared to suppress the African-American vote in a state that had a black majority.
the African Americans were the majority of the population in the state of Mississippi as a result of slavery. Today, the state of Mississippi has the largest percentage of African Americans in the country at 39% of the state. The Mississippi Plan became the model throughout the South, part of a raft of racially oppressive Jim Crow laws that ended Reconstruction. What Florida is doing is continuing the conflicts in the fight for Reconstruction. But what Republicans are doing now in Florida and Georgia and Texas, they're trying to settle this and win the war for good. They're playing for keeps. We don't understand most of this history, so we don't see this stuff coming. I'm a historian. I understand. I know what I'm looking at when I see it because I've seen it before. Okay, let's continue. Let's go back to the Brennan Center for Justice. Felony disenfranchisement in the 1868 Florida State Constitution was part of a larger effort to prevent a quote-unquote Negro legislature. Post-emancipation, after slavery ends in basically 1865, you have the 13th Amendment ratified December 6, 1865, which legally ends slavery, not the Emancipation Proclamation. That did not free the slaves. Okay, go to archives.gov and read it, or go to loc.gov, because it basically stated that the territories in rebellion, their slaves would be freed by January 1st, 1863, if they did not come back into the Union. But the territories in rebellion, they separate from the Union, set up their own government, set up the Confederate States of America in 1861, and you no longer have any authority over them. And then it also had exceptions for the border states, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. And it said that they were exempt so they could keep their slaves. Maryland did not abolish slavery until November 1st, 1864, because they put it on the ballot. That's almost 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Okay. Now, post-emancipation, legislators in Florida feared that freedmen, that black freedmen, that former slaves, who then constituted 48% of the state's population, they feared that they would take over state and local government. I'll be damned. Isn't that the fear that they have today? Isn't that the fear that, oh, what happens when these Negroes take over the state legislature? What happens when they have dominance in the House of Representatives and the Senate? The same fear that Florida had in 1868 is the same fear that they have today in 2022. The same measures that they're used in 1868, that's the same goddamn thing they're doing today. We don't have enough sense to understand history to see this stuff when it's coming so we can stop it. Post-emancipation legislators in Florida feared that black freedmen, who then constituted 48% of the state's population, would take over state and local government. The 1868 Florida State Constitution contained several provisions to prevent this from happening. So you mean they used the law to oppress African Americans? This is why I say we have to understand the law. We need to understand the law better than they understand the law. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. And I know people mean well when they say, when they tell, African Americans to vote, to exercise your right to vote, things like this. I know they mean well when they say that, but let me be very clear. You don't vote for exercise. If you want to exercise, take your ass to the gym, go work out, get a home gym like I have. You don't exercise. You don't vote for exercise. You vote for power. When you go read what happened and study this history and the laws they put in place, white people don't vote for no exercise. They vote for power. This is what we have to understand. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources. This don't have nothing to do with exercise. So in 1868, the Florida State Constitution, it contained several provisions to prevent a Negro legislature from taking place, to prevent African Americans from taking over state and local government. For example, the 1868 Florida State Constitution established a state legislative appointment scheme, that inflated the representation of predominantly white counties while deflating the representation of predominantly black counties. Oh, you mean like redrawing district lines? You mean like in Texas, where over the past 10 years, the increase in population has been non-white people, but the Texas state legislature controlled by Republicans, they found a way to create 2 white districts? You mean something like that? You mean like in Louisiana, where they're trying to redefine what black is to suppress the African American vote and reduce how many people can vote? Like in Louisiana, when they're trying to redraw these district lines? The Florida State Constitution of 1868 also gave the governor the power to appoint local officials, thereby preventing local black majorities from electing their own leaders. Oh, so now that slavery ends and they're voting and they're in these cities that have a majority African American population, now you want to take the power away from the local at the local level and send it to the governor at the state level to then appoint local officials over African Americans to prevent local African Americans, local black majorities from electing their own leaders. One legislator in Florida wrote that this and other such provisions were designed to prevent a Negro legislature, Felony disenfranchisement was yet another mechanism intended to suppress the political power of newly freed slaves. Now, it didn't say nothing about exercise. It didn't say they were trying to keep African Americans from exercising. This is about power, period. If you don't understand that, I don't know what the hell to tell you. Now, Florida's expansion of criminal disenfranchisement during Reconstruction reflected a regional and even nationwide trend. It wasn't just Florida. Studies show that many states, especially those in the former Confederacy, passed restrictive felony disenfranchisement laws in the period directly following the extension of voting rights to freedmen. So right in that era, even we see this even before 1870, shortly before 1870, we see this 1868 here in Florida. But right around that time, right in that era during Reconstruction, we see different states having felony disenfranchisement laws and is directly targeting African Americans to suppress our vote. Felony disenfranchisement was enacted in states with high black incarceration rates, as a way to reduce the effect of black suffrage, of African American voting rights. Okay. And what you're going to see in these different states like Florida, they're going to expand the different types of crimes that get classified as felonies. And they're going to target certain crimes that were believed to be committed more by African Americans to get more of us caught up in that prison system so we could not vote, to reduce the number of African Americans who could actually vote. Now, if we look at the reenactment of the felony disenfranchisement provision in 1968, the reenactment
of the felony disenfranchisement provision in 1968. When the Florida State Constitution was revised in 1968, members of the revision committee articulated no independent, non-discriminatory reason for keeping permanent felony disenfranchisement in the Constitution. They didn't come up with they couldn't articulate a really good reason to keep it in there. When the Florida State Constitution was revised in 1968, members of the revision committee articulated no independent, non-discriminatory reason for keeping permanent felony disenfranchisement in the state constitution. The public record contains no evidence. The public record contains no evidence that the members of the Constitutional Revision Commission, CRC, Constitutional Revision Commission, or the state legislature ever had any legitimate reason for maintaining the voting ban on people with felony convictions. Even though years of defending the provision in litigation, the state of Florida never established or even articulated an independent rationale for reenacting the provision in 1968. The 1968 revision to the Florida State Constitution occurred during a period of intense racial contention and was led by legislators who had shown contempt for several civil rights causes. Once again, racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, which comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy. And this is about power. Racism deals with a power structure. The 1960s was a period of racial unrest in Florida, and conflicts over the implementation of civil rights reforms often led to violence. For instance, in 1963, 1964, a civil rights campaign led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine, Florida, led to racial violence throughout the region. And 4 years later, race riots erupted in 7 cities in the state of Florida, 7 cities across the state of Florida. Attempts to stifle the voting power of African Americans in Florida also continued throughout the decade. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, which was a prominent civil rights organization, encountered many difficulties while running its 1964 voting rights drive, voter registration drives. Several members of the organization were arrested while registering African-American voters, and one election registrar explicitly opposed the group's activities. We look at what's known as Axe Handle Saturday, August 27th, 1960. Okay. Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville, Florida. There's a good article from the Washington Post that deals with this. You had about 200 Klansmen who had axe handles and baseball bats, and they used this to beat civil rights activists who were holding sit-ins at lunch counters. This is known as Axe Handle Saturday. How many people have never heard of Axe Handle Saturday in Jacksonville, Florida? if we look at this here, let's go to this article here from the Washington Post. We've talked about it before here on the show. Axe handle Saturday. The Klan's vicious attack on black protesters in Florida 60 years ago. This article by Sidney Trent, August 27th, 2020. This is a picture of one of the civil rights activists who was beaten by these cowards. A Jacksonville police officer stands with Charles Griffin after he was attacked on August 27, 1960 during a lunch counter protest by civil rights activists in Florida. This article courtesy Florida Historical Society. Okay, this is civil rights activist Charles Griffin. Okay, beaten by these white supremacists. The Florida Klansmen had armed themselves with handles. It was August 27, 1960, a year of lunch counter sit-ins by civil rights activists. The opening salvo had been fired on February 1st, 1960, when 4 African-American college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter inside a F.W. Woolworth 5 and dime store in Greensboro, North Carolina. By spring, sit-in campaigns led by young African-Americans had been organized in cities all over the South, including Lexington, Kentucky, Little Rock, Arkansas, Baltimore, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia, and Nashville, Tennessee. Surprised white onlookers spat and spewed racial epithets at the demonstrators and sometimes physically attacked them. But as spring blossomed into summer, white supremacists farther south, having watched the protests achieve success elsewhere, switched to high alert. So when young African Americans began staging sit-ins at a whites-only Woolworth lunch counter in downtown Jacksonville, Florida, that summer, 1960, the Ku Klux Klan organized. On the morning of what has become notoriously known as Axe Handle Saturday, more than 200 white cowards, 200 white men, Ku Klux Klan members, cowards, white supremacists, wielding wooden axe handles, launched a vicious attack on African-American protesters and passersby, those walking by. Before pulling the plug on an in-person convention in Jacksonville, Florida, punk-ass Donald Trump, when he was president, was scheduled to speak there on the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday, angering local activists. Now he will accept the nomination for the Republican Party in a speech from the White House. So this was back then when this took place, okay? But he was going to accept the nomination on the 6th. He was going to go to Jacksonville, Florida, and accept the nomination from the White Nationalist Party on the 60th anniversary of Axe Handle Saturday. In 1960, the Ku Klux Klan attack in Florida signaled a sharp turn in the cascading sit-in movement from spontaneous acts of racism to coordinated white supremacist brutality, according to Stanford University history professor Claiborne Carson. Quote, as the protesters began to achieve some success in the Upper South, then in the Deep South areas, resistance became more intense, said Professor Claiborne Carson, who was also founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. And they have all that information online. I do research there, so you can check that out online, Stanford University's Martin Luther King Research and Education Center. The lunch counter sit-ins that spring had inspired members of the Youth Council of the Jacksonville NAACP to launch nonviolent direct action of their own. Now, at this time in right around this time is going to be April, May 1960 that SNCC is going to be formed. Also, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Right around April, May 1960, SNCC is going to be formed as well. And SNCC comes out of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, read the rest of this article here. This deals with Axe Handle Saturday, August 27th, 1960. the Klan's vicious attack on Black protesters in Florida 60 years ago. Okay, now if we go back to this piece from the Brennan Center for Justice dealing with where's this here? Okay, we go back to this piece from the Brennan Center for Justice dealing with some of the history of Florida's disenfranchisement law written into their state constitution in 1868. Hold on, let's see here. Let's close this one out. This is what I want right here. All right. So, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, a prominent civil rights organization, encountered many difficulties while running its 1964 registration drives. Several members of the organization were arrested while registering African-American voters, and one election registrar explicitly opposed the group's activities. 8 of the 37 members of the CRC were also members of the Johns Committee, a governmental commission charged with investigating potentially subversive activities. The Johns Committee spent much of the 1950s and 60s investigating civil rights organizations, including the NAACP and CORE. George Stallings, head of the Suffrage and Election Subcommittee that recommended retaining permanent disenfranchisement to the CRC, and Bill Young, a member of the same subcommittee, were members of the Johns Committee during the CORE investigations. Stallings, in particular, had a long record as a segregationist. George Stallings, in particular, had a long record as a segregationist. He had openly declared that if segregation could not be avoided, all public schools should be shut down. Okay, if segregation could not be avoided, all public schools should be shut down. Now, like literacy tests and poll taxes, you had to pay a tax to register to vote. Like literacy tests and poll taxes, felony disenfranchisement was used to bar newly freed slaves from the voting polls. The drafters of the Florida State Constitution of 1868 consciously conceived of various mechanisms to protect the long-standing white monopoly on political power, to protect the long-standing white monopoly on political power in the state of Florida. And now notice they didn't say to protect the long-standing white exercise. They're telling you this is about power. This is not about exercise. That's why we need to stop telling people go vote to exercise your right to vote. No, this is, you vote for power. You vote for policies that are beneficial to you, your people, your community, etc. You don't vote for exercise. In 1968, the provision was enacted, but the Constitutional Revision Committee articulated no legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for retaining permanent felony disenfranchisement. Today, felony disenfranchisement continues to achieve its original purpose by disenfranchising blacks at disproportionate rates. Okay, so when I hear black conservatives say slavery was a long time ago, all the slaves are dead, things like this. They don't talk about the legacy of slavery. They don't talk about the legacy of the Civil War, the legacy of Reconstruction, how we're still feeling the repercussions of what happened over 150 years ago, 154 years ago. Today, felony disenfranchisement continues to achieve its original purpose by disenfranchising blacks at disproportionate rates. We must act now to remove this vestige of Florida's long history of racial discrimination and voter suppression. Okay, so check this out at the Brennan Center for Justice. This is history of Florida's felony disenfranchisement provision. History of Florida's felony disenfranchisement provision. All this deals with history. And those who are ignorant of history are destined to repeat it. Okay, we're going to continue here just a second. Also, if you like this type of information, you can support the African History Network, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, pay some of the bills, etc. You can, if you like this type of history, you can register for the online history classes that I teach on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. So when you go to it, you'll see the information about a radio show as well, and how to listen to the audio podcast. We have information there for Cash App and PayPal also here. But you scroll down and we have the information for the class. On Tuesdays, I teach ancient Kemet, one of the original names for Egypt, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Our next class is going to be Wednesday, October 26th, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Click right here to register here. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded, so you can watch them on demand. Even after the class is over with, a year from now, 2 years from now, you can go back and watch the entire class. Okay. So that class is on sale $80, regularly $130. Then on Tuesdays, I teach from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. Next class is Tuesday, October 25th, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Class is the same format, same calls. We start in about 1800, year 1800. We look at the 1800 U.S. Census. We deal with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the Haitian Revolution as well, because those two events are related. Okay, and we go throughout and look at history chronologically to see what leads to the Civil War taking place. And we look at the Civil War, Reconstruction, Mexican-American War, Texas Revolution, 1836, Mexican-American War, 1846, 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Compromise of 1850, Missouri Compromise of 1820, Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854. We look at what leads to the Civil War taking place. Then we look at the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow era, Great Migration, World War I, World War II, Civil Rights Movement, Black Power Movement. To look at this history chronologically to understand what happened after slavery ended, how we got to where we are today, what were the laws and policies put in place to put us in the predicament we are today, to understand where we need to go from here. To understand the laws and policies that need to be put in place to address today's conditions, you have to understand the laws and policies that were put in place to create the conditions in the first place that got us here. This is why history is so important. One of the reasons, and we know that African history and culture gives us our foundation, gives us our values, our interests, and our principles, gives us a cultural paradigm that we see reality through, gives us, and this influences our economic empowerment and political empowerment. We have a bundle pack. You can register for both classes for only $130. That's an over $300 value, because there's going to be there's bonus content that you're going to get from me, bonus lectures, things like that in digital format. So you can register right now at our website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. If you've taken any of my online classes in the past, email us right through the website, or email us at AHNshow@theAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. But you can email us right through the website. Just click on contact the African History Network. You get a 50% discount on the bundle pack. Okay, let's continue. We have the information for the class here on the thread of the broadcast as well, but I'll post the information right here. Okay, yeah, register here for the courses. Okay, let's continue. Now, there's a piece I want to look at quickly here, and then I'm going to try to squeeze in this section here dealing with Louisiana. There's a good article from Time Magazine. It's a good article from Time Magazine that deals with Florida's dark history behind their disenfranchisement law. This piece right here, as Florida restores ex-felons' right to vote. Here's the dark history behind their disenfranchisement. As Florida restores ex-felons' right to vote, here's the dark history behind their disenfranchisement. This is an article from November 7th, 2018 by Olivia B. Waxman. I'm just going to highlight a couple things here in the article. They talk about Amendment 4, okay, which we talked about already, and shared the clip from Roland Martin Unfiltered, the interview with Desmond Meade. Among the several historic results to come out of the 2018 midterm elections, November 2018 midterm elections, one was the result of voters voting to give others the right to do so. They approved a ballot initiative known as Amendment 4, or the Voter Restoration Amendment, which will amend Florida's constitution to re-enfranchise some ex-felons who had permanently lost the right to vote, upon felony conviction. Now, in the new system, they will get the right back once they complete all terms of their sentence, including parole or probation, according to the text of Amendment 4, rather than losing it forever. And in the state of Florida and 3 other states, when you lost your right to vote because of felony conviction, it was forever. Okay. The amendment excludes people convicted of murder and felony sex crimes. Amendment 4 excludes people convicted of murder and felony sex crimes. More than 1 million people will be affected. Okay, so it's like more than 1 million people will be affected. Enough newly enfranchised voters to, in theory, decide the 2020 presidential election. Florida has been an exception in its strictness on felony enfranchisement. Quote, Florida was one of 4 states whose constitution permanently disenfranchised citizens with past felony convictions. One of 4 states whose state constitution permanently disenfranchised citizens with felony convictions and granted the governor the authority to restore voting rights, according to the Brennan Center for Justice. Quote, the others are Kentucky and Iowa, where lifetime bans remain in place, and Virginia, where the governor has promised to restore voting rights on a rolling basis. So that was Governor at the time, Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia, and he did that. He had to do that on an individual basis to restore voting rights to ex-offenders. But the question of whether ex-felons should be able to vote is much bigger than just a couple of states. And the history goes all the way back to the mid-19th century, the mid-1800s. After the November 2018 vote, Tuesday, November 18 vote, Time Magazine spoke to historian Pippa Holloway, P-I-P-P-A, Pippa Holloway, author of the book Living in Infamy, Felon Disenfranchisement and the History of American Citizenship. Living in Infamy, Felon Disenfranchisement and the History of American Citizenship. They spoke with Pippa about the origins of the idea of felony disenfranchisement and what to know about how things have changed. So they asked the question, when did the disenfranchisement of felons and ex-felons first take shape as an idea? Ancient Greece and Rome. These laws were common in ancient democracies and then also utilized in early modern Europe and early modern England. Okay, these laws were common in ancient democracies and then also utilized in early modern Europe and early modern England. There actually wasn't a lot of voting back then, but if you had the right to vote, you might lose it following conviction of a crime. And it would affect you in other ways, like your ability to testify in court. So Time Magazine asked the question, the framers of the U.S. Constitution cherry-picked from English and European laws to create our system of government. Any idea how the framers viewed this issue of felony disenfranchisement? So suffrage was, or voting rights, was really left up to the states, something we're still seeing the implications of today. The 1830s is the decade when felon disenfranchisement starts happening, the 1830s. When states that already had constitutions started putting those provisions in there, and when states and territories like Florida that were writing constitutions started including them. The 1838 Florida Territorial Constitution. Now, this is before the 1868 Florida State Constitution. This is the 1838 Florida Territorial Constitution, was the first time it had a provision that barred from suffrage all persons, quote, convicted of bribery, perjury, or other infamous crimes, unquote. So Time Magazine asked the question, why were states passing felon disenfranchisement provisions in the 1830s? What was going on in history back in the 1830s? So Pippa responds, they're thinking a lot more about voting in the 1830s because we lose the property qualifications. We lose the property qualifications. So voting becomes more widespread. Prior to that, it had only been for property owners. Voting had only been for property owners. In the 1820s, there's a little more interest. Quote, do we really mean all white men, end quote. But the point I really want to emphasize is that this is not controversial. In fact, in a lot of communities, if someone murdered someone, they probably would not let you vote. In many cases, it was probably a common practice that was getting codified in the 1830s. They did this in England. They did this in the colonies. So it's not an exciting story so far. The key turning point, okay, now pay attention to this right here. The key turning point is in the Civil War. After the Civil War, African Americans are given the right to vote. African American men, specifically 15th Amendment, are given the right to vote. And in the first election after the Civil War, 1867, 1868 election, that is when Southern states began tailoring their laws to target African American voters. So all these people out here, the GOP, the white conservatives, the black conservatives, that say, oh, this was a long time ago, get over slavery. Because when I was on the Tammy Mack show, and probably on next Sunday's show, I'll share some excerpts from the Tammy Mack Business of Being Black show when I was on with these two black conservatives who, for the most part, had no clue what the hell they were talking about and didn't understand history. And the main topic of the show was, is it time to get over slavery? Is it time for black people to get over slavery? And my argument was, no, it's not time to get over slavery. It's time for America to deal with the real history of slavery